Ever get that feeling where you need to, like, really get up to speed on something new?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Like, maybe you've got a meeting or you're diving into a new field,
Hmm.
and you want to get there quickly, but you don't want to, like, skimp on the important stuff.
Right. You want the insights.
Yeah, you want those aha moments, but
Absolutely.
without, like, drowning in all the little details.
For sure.
Well, that's what we're all about here on the Deep Dive.
That's the goal.
So today we're tackling something that I think is, like, super fundamental.
Okay.
It's how do we tell if two sets of data, specifically probability distributions,
Right.
are similar or different?
Right.
It's like it's this really intuitive thing that we all kind of grasp on some level.
Yeah.
Are these two groups basically the same, or are they totally different?
Yeah. And there's a really nice framework for thinking about that mathematically called optimal transport.
Oh, yeah, I heard of that.
Yeah. So you can think of it as like the most efficient way to move one pile of sand into the shape of another pile of sand.
Gotcha.
But the problem is if the sand is spread out in a really complex way,
Yeah.
especially in many dimensions,
Mm-hmm.
figuring out the best way to move it can take forever.
Right. It's a lot of computation.
Exactly. And in a lot of situations, you need an answer much faster.
Right. We need like a shortcut, but a good
A
shortcut.
smart shortcut for sure.
Yeah. So we need ways to sort of get a sitter of how different those distributions are without spending like all the time and energy on these massive calculations.
Yeah, and that leads us to a really interesting area,
Okay.
which is comparing distributions that live on a sphere.
On a sphere. Okay.
Yeah.
So like the surface of a ball.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So like imagine you have data points scattered all over the surface of a ball.
Mhm.
That's the kind of data we're talking about, and it pops up everywhere.
Okay. More than I would have thought, probably.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the Earth itself is a sphere.
Right.
So any geographic data you have, like weather patterns or locations of events, those are spherical distributions.
Okay.
But it also shows up in cosmology,
Okay.
like directions of galaxies in the universe,
Interesting.
and even in machine learning.
How so?
Well, sometimes you map features to a sphere
Okay.
to help models understand images better.
Huh.
So it's a surprisingly common problem.
Okay, so we've got this common challenge of comparing data that's like arranged on a sphere
Right.
and doing it efficiently. So what's the breakthrough we're diving into today?
So today we're going to unpack a new method called the Spherical Tree-Sliced Wasserstein Distance,
Okay.
or STSW for short.
All right, STSW, got it.
And this is a new way to measure the difference between probability distributions on a sphere.
Okay.
And it's designed to be accurate
Right.
and way faster to compute than traditional methods.
Like full-on optimal transport.
Exactly.
Okay.
And we're going to be talking about a really cool paper
Okay.
that introduces this approach.
All right, STSW it is. Let's do it.
We'll dive in.
So before we get into the nuts and bolts of STSW, I think it's worth understanding like what makes comparing data on a sphere different or even harder than comparing like, lists of numbers.
Yeah, it's a great point because we compare data all the time, right?
Right.
But the spherical nature adds a whole new level of complexity.
Okay.
So like I was saying earlier, with optimal transport,
Mm-hmm.
it can be really computationally expensive to do that on a sphere.
Right.
So some existing methods try to simplify the problem
Okay.
by projecting the 3D sphere down to simpler shapes, like lines or circles.
Okay. So kind of like flattening it out a bit.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this is the core idea behind what's called sliced spherical optimal transport.
So like taking different slices or viewpoints of the data?
Precisely. So imagine you have your spherical data
Mm-hmm.
and you shine a light through it
Okay.
and you look at the shadow it casts on a line.
Gotcha.
By comparing those one-dimensional shadows from many different angles,
Okay.
you can start to get a feel for how different the original spherical data sets are.
Okay. I can see that. Yeah.
And the same principle applies to projecting onto circles, too.
Okay. So it's like taking a globe
Yeah.
and making it a flat map,
Right.
but doing it in a very specific mathematical way.
Exactly.
Seems like a pretty reasonable shortcut.
Yeah, it is in many cases.
But I remember you mentioning these methods had limitations.
They do.
What are they?
So the main limitation is that these projections can lose what we call topological information.
Topological information. Okay.
Yeah, so think about a donut.
Okay.
It's got that hole in the middle.
Yeah.
If you just flatten it onto a table, that hole disappears.
Right.
Similarly, when you project a sphere onto a line, you lose information
Okay.
about how points are connected around the sphere.
Okay. Like the relationship between the points changes.
Exactly. And this loss of structure can be a big deal.
In what kind of situations?
Like in cosmology, for example.
Okay.
If you're studying the large-scale structure of the universe,
Mm-hmm.
that topology is super important.
Right.
And also, while comparing things on a circle might seem simpler
Yeah.
than on a sphere,
Right.
it can still be tricky computationally,
Yeah.
often requiring something called binary search
Yeah.
to find the optimal alignment between the distributions.
So these existing shortcuts, while faster, can be a bit lossy
Yeah, you lose information.
or still kind of complicated in their own way.
Yeah, there are trade-offs.
Makes sense. So how does STSW get around those problems?
So STSW takes a different approach.
Oh.
Instead of projecting onto simple lines,
Hmm.
it uses these structures called tree systems.
Tree systems. Okay.
Yeah, like a family tree.
Right.
It has a root and branches out.
Gotcha.
These tree systems can capture more of the underlying structure of the data
Okay.
while still being computationally manageable.
Okay, so we're not just flattening it, we're using this more complex structure.
Exactly. And the key here is that by using these branching structures,
Yeah.
we keep a better sense of how things are connected on the sphere.
That makes sense because with the flattening, we were losing that connection information.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so instead of a single line of sight, we're using this branching structure.
Yeah.
So how do you actually build these spherical trees?
So you start by picking a point on the sphere.
Okay.
We call that the root.
The root of the tree.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then you picture several spherical rays coming out from that root.
Spherical rays. Okay.
Yeah, and these rays extend outwards along the surface of the sphere.
Mm-hmm.
A spherical ray is basically like taking a great circle.
A great circle like the equator.
Exactly.
Okay.
And just using half of it starting at the root.
Okay, so half a great circle.
Right. And then a spherical tree is formed by gluing together several of these spherical rays
At the root.
at the root, exactly.
So it's like a regular tree, but its branches are all curved.
Yes.
And they all meet at this one point on the sphere.
Precisely. And the really important thing is that these spherical trees
Yeah.
have a very well-defined mathematical structure. They're what we call metric spaces, defined by tree metrics.
Metric spaces, okay.
Yeah, so basically it's a way of precisely measuring distances within these tree structures.
Okay, so like how far apart 2 points are on the tree.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
And this is crucial because it lets us solve optimal transport problems directly on these trees.
And you said that's more efficient.
Way more efficient.
Okay, so that's a key point, being able to efficiently compare distributions on these trees.
Yeah.
So we've got our spherical data.
Mm-hmm.
We're now thinking about it in terms of these spherical trees.
Right.
How do we actually get from one to the other?
So this is where the spherical radon transform on spherical trees comes in.
Oh boy, that's a mouthful.
I know it sounds intimidating, but it's not too bad.
Okay.
So think of the regular radon transform
Mm-hmm.
as taking snapshots of an object from different angles.
Okay.
This spherical version does something similar,
Okay.
but instead of just lines of sight, we're taking snapshots of our data from different tree perspectives.
Tree perspectives.
Okay. Yeah, it takes the probability distribution on the sphere
Mm-hmm.
and transforms it into a distribution defined on each of these spherical trees.
Okay, so a transformation from the surface of the sphere to these tree structures.
Exactly.
So how does the probability mass from the sphere actually get distributed onto the branches of the tree?
That's a good question, and that's where splitting maps come in.
Splitting maps, all right.
So imagine you have a tiny area on the sphere
Okay.
with some probability associated with it.
Like a little blob of mass.
Exactly.
Okay.
The splitting map is like a rule book
Okay.
that tells us how to take that blob of mass and divide it up
Okay.
among the different branches or spherical rays of a spherical tree.
So a single point on the sphere could contribute some of its probability to
Yeah,
multiple branches of the tree.
that's right.
And the splitting map decides how much goes to each.
Precisely. And there's a really important property
Okay.
that these splitting maps should have.
Okay. What is it?
It's called orthogonal invariance.
Orthogonal invariance. Okay.
And it basically means that the rule book for splitting the mass
Mm-hmm.
doesn't change if you rotate the original spherical data.
Okay, so it doesn't matter how the sphere is oriented.
Exactly.
The splitting map stays the same.
That's right.
Okay, why is that important?
Well, for many real-world data sets on a sphere,
Yeah.
there's no inherent up or down.
Right.
So our method for comparing them
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't depend on how we happen to be looking at the data.
Right. It should be consistent no matter how you rotate it.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. You wouldn't want your comparison to change
Right.
just because you tilted your head.
Exactly.
So you mentioned a specific example of a splitting map.
Yeah, so the researchers propose using a function
Oh.
related to the beta function.
Beta function.
Don't worry about the math too much.
Okay, good.
but you can think of the beta function as a kind of proximity sensor on the sphere.
Okay, a proximity sensor.
Yeah, so it assigns more of a data point's influence
Okay.
to the branches of the tree that are closer to it.
So if a point on the sphere is very close to one of the branches,
Yeah,
more of its probability gets mapped to that branch.
exactly.
Okay, so we transform our spherical probability distributions onto a collection of these spherical trees.
Right.
Using these carefully chosen splitting maps.
Yes.
So now how do we use these transformed distributions to calculate this STSW distance?
Okay, so the STSW distance
Yeah.
is defined as an average of the standard Wasserstein distances,
Okay.
calculated between the transformed probability distributions on many different randomly sampled spherical trees.
So we're not just picking one tree.
Yeah.
We're generating a bunch of them.
Exactly.
Transforming the data onto each one.
Yep.
Calculating the Wasserstein distance on each tree.
Right.
Then averaging those distances.
That's it.
Okay, so we're kind of getting multiple perspectives.
Exactly.
And then combining them.
Right. And that's what makes the overall computation much more manageable.
So it's like instead of just one look at how different the data is, we're taking many different measurements and then averaging them.
Precisely.
To get a more complete picture.
Exactly.
And this is where another big advantage comes in.
Okay, tell me about it.
The Wasserstein distance.
Yeah.
Which, remember, is that measure of how to optimally move probability mass. It has a closed form expression when you calculate it on these tree structures.
Yeah, that's huge.
That's huge because it means we can calculate it directly without having to do a bunch of complex optimization.
Exactly. It's a direct, efficient calculation.
Which was one of our goals.
Absolutely.
To make this computationally tractable.
Right.
So in practice, when we have a set of data points on a sphere, how do we compute this STSW distance?
So for discrete data, which is what we usually have, we use something called Monte Carlo sampling.
Okay.
So basically, we randomly generate a bunch of these spherical trees, do the transformation using our splitting map, calculate the Wasserstein distance on each tree.
Right. And then take the average of all those distances.
Exactly.
And the more trees we sample,
Yep.
the better our approximation gets.
Precisely.
So randomly sample trees, transform the data,
Yep.
calculate the Wasserstein distance on each tree, and then average the results.
You got it.
Got it. Now, how is that Wasserstein distance actually computed on a single spherical tree when we have these data points?
So imagine your data points on the sphere.
Yeah.
And they get mapped onto the tree.
Okay.
Each point ends up at a certain distance along one of the branches.
Right.
The Wasserstein distance on the tree basically looks at the differences in the cumulative probability mass as you move along those branches.
So like how much probability mass is there up to a certain point?
Exactly.
Okay.
And it figures out the most efficient way to rearrange the mass from one distribution to match the other.
Okay.
Taking into account the distances along the branches.
So it's like finding the best way to move the probability around to make the two distributions match.
Right.
Okay, and because we have this direct formula for the Wasserstein distance on a tree, you mentioned that the whole STSW calculation is parallelizable?
Absolutely.
Okay, so what does that mean exactly?
So it means that each of those Wasserstein distance calculations
For each tree?
Can be done completely independently.
Okay.
So you can run them all at the same time on different processors or GPUs.
Gotcha, so it speeds up the whole process.
Massively.
Okay, that's a big win for computational efficiency.
Yeah, definitely.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've talked about the spherical trees, the transformation process, the splitting maps, and the final STSW distance as this average of Wasserstein distances on all these trees.
Exactly.
But how well does it actually work in practice?
That's the real question, right?
Exactly. The paper you mentioned had some experiments, right?
It did.
So what did they find?
So they compared STSW to a bunch of other state-of-the-art methods for comparing spherical distributions.
Okay, like what kind of method?
So they looked at different versions of slice Wasserstein, or SW.
Okay.
Spherical slice Wasserstein, or SSW. And stereographic spherical slice Wasserstein, or S3W.
Okay, so a bunch of different approaches.
Right, a good mix.
Then what were the main tasks they used to test these methods?
So they focused on 4 key areas.
Okay, hit me.
First, learning one probability distribution from another using something called gradient flow.
Okay.
Second, they applied these methods in self-supervised learning for image data.
Interesting.
Third, they looked at estimating the density of events on the Earth's surface.
Okay, a real-world application.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, they used STSW within a sliced Wasserstein autoencoder for generative modeling.
Yeah. A lot to unpack there, but let's start with gradient flow.
Okay.
What is that exactly?
Now, so imagine you have one probability distribution, and you want to gradually morph it into another target distribution.
Yep.
Gradient flow is a way to find the best way to make those changes step by step.
Okay.
By always moving in the direction that minimizes the distance between your current distribution and the target.
Gotcha. So it's like finding the smoothest path from one distribution to another.
Right. And what they found was that STSW was really good at this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it outperformed the other methods.
In what way?
Well, it was more accurate in how it learned the target distribution.
Okay.
And it also got there faster.
So more accurate and faster?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they measured this using some mathematical tools.
Okay.
Like the log2 Wasserstein distance and the negative log likelihood.
Okay, so STSW was better at guiding that transformation.
Yeah, it was much smoother and more efficient.
That's really interesting. What about the self-supervised learning stuff?
Right. So in self-supervised learning, especially for images, one common technique is to take the features that a neural network learns and normalize them so they lie on a sphere.
On a sphere. Okay.
Yeah. And the idea is that this helps the network learn better features.
Yeah.
Features that are more robust and generalizable. And one goal in this process is to make sure those features are spread out evenly on the sphere.
Okay, so like no clumping.
Right. We want uniformity.
Gotcha.
And the researchers used STSW to measure this uniformity.
Okay.
And encourage the network to learn better features.
So STSW is like a guiding force in the learning process?
Yeah, exactly.
And what were the results?
So they tested it on a common image data set called CIFAR-10.
Okay.
And they found that using STSW led to better accuracy.
Oh, wow.
When they evaluated the network on a separate task.
So STSW helped the network learn better representations of the images.
Yeah, it seems like it.
That's pretty impressive. You also mentioned an application for like real-world data.
Yeah, so they used STSW for Earth density estimation.
Right.
Which is basically trying to understand how things are distributed on the Earth's surface.
So like where do earthquakes happen most often?
Exactly, or wildfires or floods.
Okay.
And they compared STSW to other methods for estimating these densities. And the results were really promising.
How so?
Well, STSW performed just as well as the existing methods.
Okay.
And in some cases, even better.
Wow, so it's competitive.
Yeah, very much so.
And what's even better is that it often did this with less computation.
That's right. It was faster and more efficient.
Okay, so not just good in theory, but good in practice too.
Absolutely.
All right, so finally, you mentioned this thing called a sliced Wasserstein autoencoder.
Yes.
SWE.
Yeah, so this is a type of generative model.
Generative model.
Yeah, so these models learn to generate new data.
Oh, cool.
That looks similar to the data they were trained on.
Okay, so like they learn the patterns, and then they can create new stuff based on those patterns.
Precisely.
Interesting.
And they use Wasserstein distances to help them learn.
Okay.
And the researchers found that STSW worked really well in these SWEs.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they tested it on CIFAR-10 again. Oh. And STSW was the best at learning a good representation of the data.
Okay.
It wasn't the best at perfectly reconstructing the images.
Okay.
But it did learn a very well-organized and meaningful internal representation.
So it understood the data really well.
Yeah.
Even if it couldn't spit out perfect copies.
Right.
That's still really valuable.
It is, especially for certain tasks.
So it sounds like STSW has a lot going for it.
It does.
But if you had to sum it up, what would you say is like the core innovation here?
I think the key is the use of those spherical trees.
Right.
As the structures for comparing the distributions.
Okay.
This lets STSW capture more of the geometry and topology of the data.
Than just flattening it.
Exactly.
And that leads to better comparison.
Yeah, more accurate and meaningful comparisons.
So for someone listening who might be dealing with spherical data, what are the main benefits of using STSW?
So the main advantages are better performance.
Okay.
Which we saw in the experiments.
Right.
And the fact that it's computationally efficient.
Right, because of those closed-form solutions and the parallelization.
Exactly.
So if you're working with data on a sphere, STSW is worth checking out.
Definitely. It's a powerful tool.
Okay, so for you, the listener, if you're dealing with data sets on our planet, or in cosmology, or even in machine learning, this STSW method is a promising new way
to
understand the relationships in your data.
And it makes you wonder, what other areas could benefit from this kind of approach.
Yeah, what other fields might see breakthroughs.
Exactly, because spherical data is everywhere.
It's really food for thought.
For sure.
And it sounds like there's a lot of potential for future work in this area.
Definitely, the researchers themselves mentioned that there are more sophisticated ways to construct those spherical trees.
Okay.
And maybe even adapt other mathematical tools to this framework.
So it's an active area of research.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot more to explore.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive into the world of spherical data and STSW. Hopefully this has given you a good understanding of this really cool new approach.
Yeah, it's a powerful tool.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
Thanks for having me.